Welcome, everyone. It's a real honor for me tonight to welcome you all at a very special talk in the Mind Matters series at Mind and Life Europe. My name is Gábor Karsai, Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe, and our special guest is Rebecca Crane. Before introducing Rebecca to you all, I would like to invite everyone to choose a channel because we are translating this talk into multiple languages, Spanish, French, and Chinese, and you can find your own channel in the interpretation function further below in the screen. I would also like to ask our colleagues, fellow translators, to start the recording in their own language, the French, the Spanish, and the Chinese. And I would like to introduce them. Our French interpreter tonight is Geneviève Amelé, the president of the Association for the Development of Mindfulness in France. Michelle Fan and Betty Chen, the translators of the Chinese version. And Nuria Mestre, who offered her kind help to translate the talk and the discussion tonight into Spanish. We are going to have approximately 40 minutes this talk with Rebecca, and then after her sharing, we will be able to have a discussion as well. And I would like to invite everyone to think about questions and post them in the chat in their own language, and our interpreters will translate them into English, and I will be able to read out loud. Please forgive me if I won't be able to read all the questions. We may not have time for all questions tonight, but I'm trying to do my best. So let me introduce our special guest, Professor Rebecca Crane. She directs the Center for Mindfulness Research and Practice at Bangor University and has played a leading role in developing its training and research program since it was founded in 2001. She teaches mindfulness-based programs, teachers, trainers, and supervisors internationally, and guides mindfulness retreats. She trained originally as an occupational therapist and later as an integrative counselor, and worked in the UK National Health Service, offering therapy to people with complex mental health challenges for more than 15 years. As you may know, the Mind Matters series is a special program of Mind and Life Europe. It offers live talks on a quarterly basis for the general public and has already attracted thousands of views on our YouTube channel, with such notable past speakers as Roshi John Halifax, Richard Davidson, Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, Alan Wallace, and Matthew Ricard. So it's a real honor for us tonight to have you, Rebecca, with us and to listen to your great wisdom and knowledge. And the title of your speech is Teaching Mindfulness-Based Programs with Quality and Integrity. We're very much looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Gábor, for that generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, with you all. And particular thank yous to the Mind and Life team, to Gábor and Joanna and the rest of the Mind and Life team, and to the translators. It's amazing to have your support in this process. And thank you to all of you for showing up here, and to those of you who will watch this later on the recording. So the theme of investigating what it means to teach mindfulness-based programs, or MBPs as I'll call them in the talk, with quality and integrity has been very much core to my process for the last 25 years. I've always seen MBP teachers as potent members of their communities on a global level. There is, of course, a lot we need to do to ensure true representation of MBP teachers across the demographic of our society. But nevertheless, MBP teachers are present on every continent of this planet and are holding learning spaces in a diversity of contexts with a diversity of populations. And this work at its best is deeply transformational. So the quality and the integrity of these teachers profoundly matters. They're touching many people, and it's so important we don't waste the potential of this opportunity. So the Centre for Mindfulness at Bangor University in North Wales, the UK, where I'm based, emerged because Professor Mark Williams, one of the developers of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, was based here during the 80s and the 90s when he was in the midst of developing MBCT. And the first trial of MBCT was published in 2000, and it reported a very powerful result for people with depression vulnerability. And on a much broader level, MBCT pioneered a model of how to skillfully integrate understandings from contemporary cognitive science with the core DNA of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction. And Bangor University became a hub for people who were interested to train as an MBP teacher, and I was appointed in 2001 to lead those developments. And as a team, the tensions that are inherent in the meeting place between our mainstream institutions and contemplative practices have always been at the heart of our work. The questions that at the frontier of our practice right from the beginning were questions like, what exactly are the skills and understandings and orientations that underpin skillful MBP teachings? What methods are optimal for cultivating these? And because we were training in the context of a master's program, we needed to ask, how do we assess that these various capacities are in place? How do we preserve the transformational potential of mindfulness, whilst at the same time making it a pragmatic reality in our schools, our workplaces, our health service, and so on? So a few personal threads as a bit of context. I was experienced clinically in the mental health field and had been trained in MBCT by Mark Williams and in MBSR through training with teachers in the US at UMass. But I was an academic novice and a novice mindfulness-based trainer. And of course, our inner process offers a mirror for the more public-facing work we do. And I was my own fiercest critic about the teaching and the training and the leadership that I was engaged in. I held myself to really high standards and initially assumed that I was the only person who lived with this feeling of being an imposter. But as I engaged with trainees and with close colleagues, some of them in this space here now, I began to discover that this sense of concern about not being good enough was very common. And the carrying of a sense of fear that we'll be discovered as a fraud, or the questioning of who am I to be doing this work? But at the same time, I had a deep sense that I had found my calling. So there was never any doubt for me about whether to stay with it or not. It was more of a question of how to engage. I'd had a mindfulness practice since my late teens, early 20s, when I spent time in India and Thailand. But this period of growing a university mindfulness center alongside parenting 3 young children was a catalyst for my practice to embed into my being in a whole new way. I see now as I look back that this was a process of re-embodying, coming back more fully into my own being, inhabiting my own body, and discovering how to feel my way into situations rather than just think my way through them. So over time, I did notice that the thoughts that drove my sense of being an imposter still visited, as did the fears of public speaking. But I naturally began to relate very differently to them and found that I could hold them in a wider container rather than being consumed by them. At a certain point, I began to notice that those particular thought streams were no longer flowing. And interestingly, from a Buddhist perspective, the idea that we're either better than or less good than others is a form of conceit. Both take us into identification with the self, and in that we lose touch with our capacity to be present with the full dimensionality of experience within our own being. And we lose touch with others around us and with the world. When we're consumed by these identity worries, we tend to believe that everyone else has it sorted and that we're the only one feeling like this. We get trapped in an isolated place. The reality is that most of us feel some version of this vulnerability in different aspects and times of our lives. And like all human suffering, if we discover the capacity to hold it in kindly awareness, it's a practice gateway. A gateway into recognizing the core vulnerability we all have as humans. As thinking animals, we have this vulnerability that is unique in the animal world to become estranged from ourselves, disconnected from others, And within this, we lose touch with our wise mind and with what truly matters. So although stress reduction is in the title of MBSR, this program and every MBP are far more than stress reduction or depression prevention or making us feel better day to day. Of course, these are often initial entry points, but MBPs are about catalyzing a deeper transformation in our relationship to our bodies, our feelings, our thoughts, and interpersonal relationships, about discovering how to be in wise and ethical relationship with inner and outer experience, and how this can be the ground for moving and behaving in the world in ways that serve. We discover how to move away from relentless activity and achievement towards an orientation of being and presence. So I'm sharing some of these personal threads because this work is always both highly personal and deeply universal. The connection into universal understandings about experience comes through the doorway of being in kindly and wise connection with our own experience. A theme that threads through this talk is that of re-embodying, that coming back into connection with the immediacy of felt experience close in, right now, in our own body, is a key gateway to rediscovering our own ground and truth. It's an ongoing moment-by-moment practice in this highly unstable body, in the context of a world that's highly unstable and changing. We can only arrive into presence in this moment. And this moment might feel vulnerable and wobbly and unstable, or a host of other experiences. But having the courage to live our lives and offer our teaching from this connection to the ever-changing dynamic reality of this moment is an essential capacity for MBP teachers. So I'm going to reflect now on some of the very valid concerns that there are about quality and integrity of MBP teaching, and the tensions we're navigating as we bring mindfulness programs into our mainstream institutions. And then I'll share some reflections on our stance towards these. I'd like to enter into this by sharing a poem that I think most of you will know by Rumi, the poem called Two Kinds of Intelligence. And in this, he points to the diverse capacities that we have as humans. So maybe as you listen to these words from Rumi coming from the 13th century, just connecting with your own being here, just landing into contact with the sense of your body here and allowing the words to come to you and just being open to how they touch you. So Rumi says, there are two kinds of intelligence. One acquired as a child in school memorizes facts and concepts from books and from what the teacher says, collecting information from the traditional sciences as well as from the new sciences. With such intelligence, you rise in the world, you get ranked ahead or behind others in regard to your competence in retaining information. You stroll with this intelligence in and out of fields of knowledge, getting always more marks on your preserving tablets. There's another kind of tablet, one already completed and preserved inside you. A spring overflowing its springbox, a freshness in the center of the chest. This other intelligence does not turn yellow or stagnate. It's fluid, and it doesn't move from outside to inside through conduits of plumbing learning. This second knowing is a fountainhead from within you, moving out. I love the way that Rumi calls us into connection with the intelligence within us, that we so easily lose touch with. It so easily gets obscured by the training and conditioning that we receive through our lives to think more cleverly, to improve ourselves, to strive, to become good. And of course, our mainstream institutions are embedded in an orientation that emphasizes the first paradigm that Rumi speaks about, the ranking, the taking in of information, the emphasis on measurement and outcome efficiency and value for money. Whereas contemplative practices encourage the other intelligence within us to flower, the tablet that is already complete and preserved within us, but we're so often cut off from. It is a very real challenge to bring these worlds together in ways that honour the integrity of both mindfulness and the ethos of our mainstream institutions. I really do feel, though, the importance of celebrating both the capacities that Rumi points to that we have as humans. It's vital that we discover how to connect, how to reconnect with our felt experience, the soft animal of our body, as Mary Oliver says. It's also important that we honour the importance of offering evidence-based interventions that don't cause harm, that offer value for money, that communicate contemporary understandings about human psychology and physiology, and that are contextualized in ways that are inclusive for the breadth of our population. It's not thinking per se that's the problem. Indeed, through mindfulness practice, we're freeing up our thinking capacities from unhelpful habit patterns so they can be used in the service of well-being, flourishing, and wisdom. So I really see my work, and I imagine all of you also see your work as bridging and creating conversation between the two worlds that Rumi points to in his poem, between the worlds of contemplative practice and the worlds of academia, Western science and empiricism, and the ethos of our mainstream institutions. They can feel like separate worlds. And there's a lot of pain and suffering in this disconnect, and we all know this disconnect because we're all part of the social structures of our workplaces, health service, schools, government, and so on. But when the best of the ethos of our mainstream come together as one world with contemplative practices taught with depth and integrity, there is a creative and transformative synergy. The science informs how we offer programs that are optimally effective, and the contemplative teachings and practices are creatively interwoven with contemporary theoretical and empirical understanding. Participants are touched in transformative ways, and perhaps even more significantly, this work can catalyze tangible shifts in perspective and orientation at a systemic level. So this is the aspiration and the vision, and in pockets of practice, it's a lived reality. But there clearly are tensions in this process of integration, and there's a lot expressed in the literature about the concern that the depth of mindfulness practice at times gets lost in this process of recontextualizing it into the mainstream. There's concerns about the commodification and commercialization of mindfulness. Concerns that mindfulness is being taught as a solitary practice rather than as a relational, interpersonal way of being in the world. And that this individual orientation can have the effect of narrowing concern to my mind processes, my well-being, my effectiveness and success, rather than extending out to a sense of wider social responsibility and compassion for others. And recognizing that my well-being is totally contingent on your well-being and on the well-being of all living systems. There are concerns that the new generation of teachers are not embedded in the depth of teachings that inform the practice of mindfulness, including the emphasis that is placed on ethics, when mindfulness is taught as part of an embedded set of practices within the Buddhist tradition. There are concerns that mindfulness is being promoted and taught as a quick fix, and that the instrumental aims of MBPs, when taught in mainstream settings, override the deeper transformative potential of the practice. These concerns have some validity, and they do need attention. So when we bring this work into the academy, into the health service, into our schools and so on, we will constantly be bumping up against paradigm differences, and we need to be creative and nimble in working with them. Our research work investigating the factors that optimize the implementation of mindfulness-based programs in the UK Health Service showed that the very particular ways that the MBCT teachers were championing the program were critical to enabling uptake, And there are inspiring examples of practice in our health service of MBCT teachers with a strong mindfulness practice, engaging in a huge amount of relational, skilled work within their institution to build engagement and interest and enthusiasm for implementing MBCT. These teachers offer courses to their leadership team. They build grassroots engagement within patient and staff communities. They go the extra mile to ensure that the MBCT teachers in their institutions are well trained, well supported. And I'm saying all this because just really it's so important to recognize that embedding MBPs into our mainstream requires depth skill, both in teaching MBPs, but also there's a range of surrounding skills to work skillfully with the cultural tensions and to build momentum in the organization to proactively support implementation. And when this is happening optimally, it does impact on multiple layers within the organization. I've always been inspired with John Kabat-Zinn's original vision for MBSR. So of course, a key intention of each offering of MBSR is to enable individuals in that course to discover more skillful ways of being. But then alongside this, there's a wider vision, which is that the very presence of this course within the hospital system or whatever system it's within opens the institution to new ways of thinking and being. And of course, that's slow and it's uphill work. But we can see over the last few decades that integrative and participatory medicine, which embraces the connection between body, mind, and heart, has been recognized and embraced as a field. And when John was starting out, that was really not the case. So I'll transition now to reflecting on the knowledge and skills that are needed to teach mindfulness-based programs. So at Bangor University, we train, as I was saying earlier, both in the context of a master's program, and we also have a more informal training pathway. But within the master's program, it was necessary for us to think very early on about how to assess the skills of the teacher. And this journey brought us into the tensions around integrating Rumi's two sorts of intelligence into start relief. So we were training people in non-striving and acceptance in an academic program that's embedded in grading and assessment. We were cultivating being mode within the teaching whilst simultaneously embracing the concept of competencies, which have connotations of performance and success and measurements. So these paradoxes and these tensions that we're navigating are just inherent in the process. But we really felt that they held us, and they do hold us now, to the fire of ensuring that we stay close to our motivations and our aspirations. So the rigor of the academic environment steered us in wholesome directions as long as we remain passionately connected to the essence of why we're doing what we're doing. So we did and we do care about standards and quality. And if mindfulness practice was to become a common sense part of mainstream life, there was work to be done to align some of our processes towards the norms of mainstream institutions. And this meant that things like professional standards for practice, professional organizations and structures, competence frameworks, and so on were needed. We were acutely aware of the potential shadow side of all of these, primarily the risk of losing touch with the main thing being nurturing the growth of teachers who embody and are connected to the essence and the underpinning teachings of mindfulness and supporting their practice in an ongoing way. I really love Stephen Covey's phrase, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. I'll say it again. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. So whenever we get lost, our question to ourselves was and is, what is the main thing? What's the core intention, the central aspiration we're pointing ourselves towards? Let's not lose sight of that. Let's ensure that all our developments are in the service of this main thing. And our main thing is nurturing the growth of teachers, because they're the conduit. Every trained mindfulness-based teacher touches many, many people through their teaching practice. And how they touch each person is of deep significance to the world. We can so easily get distracted by many other non-main things that are going on around us. So one key development within this whole body of work that I'll name is the MBITAC, the Mindfulness-Based Interventions Teaching Assessment Criteria. It's basically a framework that describes the skill of the teacher, which can be used in a range of ways, including assessment, but also as a support to reflective development. And it's been taken up in mindfulness-based training programs globally, and it's been a very collaborative cross-centre development with colleagues in centres across the UK, at Oxford and Exeter, but also colleagues at Brown and UMass and others. There's just been an input from lots of people, including many in this space now. And the MBITAC, this framework has helped to create a sense of join up, a way of communicating with each other about the core skills needed for mindfulness-based teaching. I'll just briefly share my screen. So the framework describes 6 domains, and the slide shows those 6 domains. So each is an area of skill within the program, within the delivery of a mindfulness-based program. So if you go to the web page that's cited on that slide, you'll find a lot of detail underneath each of these titles and accompanying resources for using the framework in a range of ways. And I'll unpack each of these domains in a moment. But first, I just want to show you this slide. I'd like to orient you to this paper, which aims to define the core ingredients of any program that calls itself mindfulness-based. So in this paper, we drew from the metaphor of weaving a piece of cloth. And we called the vertical fabric, the vertical threads that run down the fabric, the warp elements. Without these, the fabric basically doesn't have strength and integrity when you're weaving. It falls apart. So within a mindfulness-based program, there's these essential elements that always have to be present to really ensure it's mindfulness-based. And then there's weft elements, which are variable and creative and dependent on the context and the particular setting and the population. So we were clear that the skills described and mapped in the MBITAC were one aspect of warp elements. So they're sort of in relation to the teacher. There's lots of other elements, but in relation to the teaching and the teacher, these are essential skills that all MBP teachers need, whatever the mindfulness-based program. So there's many programs that have evolved out of MBCT and MBSR, a whole family of programs, and they all require teachers to be embedded in these skills. So these skills within the MBITAC they're aimed to clarify actually the very tangible skills that the teacher needs in the teaching space. But we're very clear that this isn't everything that is needed. So mindfulness-based teachers need a lot of surrounding skills and understandings. And so we build into our training programs training in reflective practice, exploration of ethics from both a professional practice perspective and from the perspective of ethics as the ground from which mindfulness teaching is embedded. Trainees need support to cultivate their personal mindfulness practice and to ground this in an understanding of the origins and various functions of mindfulness, and an experiential understanding of the main underpinning teachings. And whilst our trainees are on their training journey, we require them to take 2 retreats designed to anchor their practice into the key Buddhist psychological teachings, specifically the 4 foundations or 4 ways of establishing mindfulness and the 4 friends for life: befriending, joy, compassion, and equanimity. And then there's important input on how to skillfully adapt mindfulness-based programs so that the delivery is sensitively tailored and responsive to culture, context, need, and population. There's training on awareness of doing no harm and teaching from a trauma-sensitive perspective. And linked to these is the importance of inspiring mindfulness teachers to engage in a lifetime practice of training around personal recognition of personal conditioning and bias, and education on ways of teaching that are inclusive. So I'm going to speak now on the skills that are framed within these 6 domains, but it's important to hold in mind that these are part of the picture and they're absolutely critical part, but there are surrounding skills that are also really vital. I'm going to speak first and in most depth about domain 4, the embodying domain, because in a way that's the domain where a lot of the concerns around integrity are centered. So embodying. So this is the process essentially by which the teacher makes the essence of mindfulness tangible and clear to participants. It's the way in which teachers' personal practice of mindfulness and their engagement with the teachings around this are communicated. And the content of what teachers teach is important. But here, in the context of embodying, we're talking about the teacher's non-verbal way of being, non-verbal communication, the way that mindfulness is implicitly communicated through how the teacher is with themselves, within their bodies, how they respond to unexpected moments in the teaching space. So mindfulness-based participants thus experience being in a space that's infused with mindfulness, and they gradually can experiment with taking those qualities into their own way of being. So embodying involves the teacher engaging in a dynamic, in-the-moment connection with immediacy of inner felt experience and responding within the teaching space from this connection. It involves having a deep lived experience of the teachings surrounding the practice of mindfulness, so that these can be spontaneously woven into the participant's experience. So every time we teach, however experienced we are, it basically comes down to the in-the-moment unpredictability of the connections that are happening in the teaching space. Mindfulness-based programs are interactive, and they're, in a way, because of that, they're unpredictable and unplannable. And this unplannability tends to push our vulnerability and our fear buttons as mindfulness-based teachers. In an attempt to be in control in difficult moments in the teaching process, we can easily be triggered into a habit pattern of disconnect. We'll all have our own ways of doing this. Mine is to move into ideas and theory. And theory and ideas are helpful. But if I go there as part of a fear reaction, I disconnect from myself. And if I'm disconnected from myself, I cannot connect with you or with others. And importantly, when this happens, everyone in the space in that moment has missed an opportunity to discover ways of inhabiting and embodying another way of being with difficulty in our lives. One example of this dynamic in action that was a significant learning moment for me relates to when I was part of a team offering MBCT courses for people who experience suicidal depression, part of a research trial led by Mark Williams. And we spent hours as a teaching team agonizing about the content of session 5. So as many of you know, in mindfulness-based programs, this is typically the session where the nature of the core difficulties and challenge that the group are working with are unpacked, so that participants are supported to recognize the elements that make up this difficult area of experience. As teachers, we felt the importance of bringing the elephant into the room for this group and taking a look at it. And the elephant for this group being the experience of intense distress that leads to the future looking relentlessly bleak and hopeless. As a teaching group, we spent hours exploring ways of bringing this theme into the space through various exercises and theoretical models. And at a certain point in this process, Mark paused our exploration, and he invited us to connect with the fear and the vulnerability we were personally feeling as teachers in opening up this difficult territory with our participants. And through this, we connected with the reality that all the clever theories and exercises we were exploring were really a cover for our own fear. Mark reconnected us back with the main thing, which in this case was embodying the potential that all experience is basically workable, and that we can develop the capacities within ourselves to hold in kindly awareness even the most toxic, scary, challenging inner experience. And that the most important thing for us as teachers throughout this session was to prioritize connection with this potential. We might draw on a range of theories and exercises to support exploration of that, but they are in the service of the essence of the session, which is, so the curriculum content itself is absolutely not the main thing. So I've deliberately spoken in more detail about one of the 6 domains, that of embodying, but I'll briefly touch on the others now. So domain 1 addresses how the teacher holds and offers the curriculum, balancing delivering the content with the need for responsiveness and flexibility. Domain 2 is the relational skills domain, and it covers the relational connection between teachers and participants. This is really aligned with the capacities underpinning embodiment at domain 4. The practice of mindfulness is basically one of relationality, like of how I can be in relationship within my own being with experience. And this domain of teaching skill expresses how this way of being gets expressed in interpersonal connection between participants and the teacher. Domain 3 covers the particular ways of guiding mindfulness practices that are part of MBPs, guiding in ways that make the key learning for each practice accessible and available to participants, guiding in ways that are safe and invitational, flexible, inclusive, responsive. And domain 5 covers the diversity of interactional teaching processes used in MBP teaching. So this includes inquiry, group dialogue, interpersonal mindfulness practices, didactic teaching, facilitating group exercises, giving instructions, using poetry, story, metaphor, and so on. So the methods vary widely and require creativity and responsiveness on the part of the teacher. And they require the teacher to be deeply immersed in the key themes that are being drawn forth and skilled in facilitating ways of bringing these to life in co-created ways with the group. And then finally, domain 6 covers the way in which the teacher creates and sustains a group learning environment that feels safe enough to do the challenging work that participants have come to do. An environment that makes room for both the personal experience of participants, but also the bigger understandings that these point to. So moving out now from some of the particular skill areas back into some of these wider dynamics that we're navigating and the tensions within which they sit. I'm just going to share my slides again very briefly. So there is really beautiful work happening in many regions to create and develop associations which support the integrity of this work by clarifying and disseminating good practice principles to enable mindfulness-based teachers to have a collective voice, to support the general public to access teachers who have appropriate credentials. These are the ones I'm familiar with, and I'm sure there's others, but all of them are labours of love involving hours of voluntary work by colleagues in the field, who want to work to support integrity. EAMBA is doing amazing work across Europe, supporting teachers and supporting integrity. BAMBA brings together training organisations across the UK to work collaboratively together. The Irish Mindfulness Teachers Association, as far as I know, the only nation worldwide who has formally constituted a professional body for mindfulness-based teachers, which is an important step in underlining the credibility of the work to policymakers and the general public. And then the International Mindfulness Integrity Network, which is aiming to communicate and support standards of practice at a meta international level, and particularly aspiring to support mindfulness-based practice in regions worldwide that are newly emerging in this work. So we're continually at the edge of what we know as we bring the practice of mindfulness into our mainstream. I could not have predicted 20 years ago that this work would have had the level of traction that it currently has, and it's inspiring. I could also not have predicted the multiple intersecting crises that we as a species and a planet are facing into. Never was the work of cultivating awareness and wisdom and compassion more vital. And clearly, business as usual is no longer okay, including in the field of mindfulness-based programs. The current context is asking for something new from us all. So, I still really believe that the vehicles of programs such as MBSR and MBCT and other established mindfulness-based programs are important anchors. They're depth programs that are empirically supported, and they'll continue to have an important place. But there is also a need for creative innovation. It's vital that our teachings in all contexts support the recognition that my personal well-being is totally contingent on the well-being of all of us and of all living systems, and that each of us is needed to support what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, the shift on a collective level to a life-sustaining ways of living. So we do need to keep connection to the depth of this work, to growing the capacity for mindfulness-based teachers to be embodied, because that's the main thing in this context. It's the way that this work can be of particular service to the world. And simultaneously, we need to be open to new models and ways of enabling the work to have traction on the issues that matter to us most as species just now. Many people will access mindfulness learning through apps and books, and these are important and really valid entry points. I don't believe, though, that these will replace the relational work that happens in an MBP learning space. It's very hard to sustain this work on one's own and very hard to engage with difficult, painful aspects of experience without the support of a teacher and a group. And there's an ever-present tension around putting energy into depth and breadth as this work grows. So as I draw to a close, I'd like to really underline that MBP teachers are not special beings, but they have invested in practice and are committed to this as a path in their lives and as a framework for understanding and holding and meeting and creatively engaging with distress and suffering and stress. I've been recently really touched by reading Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, and this theme of body-to-body connection and communication in the context of deep suffering is so clearly communicated. And this is a brief quote where he speaks about the importance of settling the body as the ground for healing. He says, although they don't always realize it, people visit my office to be with my settled, regulated nervous system. Over time, their repeated contact with my nervous system helps their nervous system settle. This does not happen through a process of mirroring or cognitive training or verbal communication. What takes place is energetic, chemical, biological, a syncing of vibrations and energies. My settled nervous system isn't an accident of birth. It is the result of my training, my education, my experience, and my long-standing and mindful self-care. Gather together a large group of unsettled bodies, and then unsettle them more, and you get a mob or a riot. But bring together a large group of settled bodies, and you have a potential movement, a potential force for tremendous good in the world. A calm, settled body is the foundation for health, for healing, for helping others, and for changing the world. Reading this book was such a strong call to me to remember that this work of living into the truths of our own beings is the practice of a lifetime, and that we offer a lot to the world if we take responsibility to engage with our personal disconnects and suffering. So this is both very personal and also work that we can only really engage in as a collective. So coming together in an MBP classroom or in other intentional ways is really vital. And we're discovering in this pandemic time that it actually really works to do this online as we're doing right now. So this territory of embodying really matters. Alienation is one of the prevalent themes challenging us on a societal level. Mindfulness is one of many doorways into healing this, opening space for participants to inhabit their own being and to reclaim their connectivity with what they most deeply care about. And I'm going to close with some words from Brené Brown. She also speaks about how this inner personal healing is very much in the service of others. She says, I think one of the reasons we're so disconnected from each other is that we're so untethered from ourselves. One of the reasons we're so disconnected from each other is that we're so untethered from ourselves. And I think if we're going to find our way back to each other, we're going to have to find our way back to ourselves first. And we're going to have to find some humanity in ourselves so that we can embrace the humanity and pain of other people. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you for this really sensitive and deep sharing of your work and the multiple facets of the programs. I invited in the meantime more participants, guests who are here with us tonight to think about questions. And we have received some already. So if you don't mind, I would like to invite some of the questions one by one.
Yeah, I'd love to engage in that way.
Yes. And I would like to start with Aida Duro. If you can hear the question that we received in the chat directly.
Yes,
Aida.
thank you. Thank you, Gabor, and thank you, Rebecca, for this talk. Very appreciated. I wanted to ask something about the MBI tech and how far the MBI tech could be used as a feedback. I have personally never gotten any feedback, and I know it's about non-striving, but I would have really appreciated some kind of feedback.
Absolutely, and it's a really beautiful way to learn, to have peers and mentors offering reflective feedback to us on our teaching practice. And although we originally developed the MBI TAC as a way of assessing teachers, actually in practice, that's what you're talking about is the way that it's being used much more widely. And we've recently, my colleague Gemma Griffiths at the university in Bangor has developed a version of the MBI TAC that strips away all of the assessment piece. So it's really much more just foregrounding these skills and helping us to see the breadth of skills that we're using. And you can use it as a way of giving feedback and reflecting on your own practice, but you can also invite a colleague or a mentor or a peer to either come into the session and give you some feedback afterwards, or you could record and then use it as a way of reflecting with colleagues afterwards. We found, although it's a tender and vulnerable making thing to do, recording your own teaching practice and then pausing and stepping back and reflecting on it is an amazing learning catalyst. So if you go to the MBI TAC website, you'll see various resources there for using it as a feedback tool. And so look for the TLC, the Teaching and Learning Companion. That's the version that's designed for that.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The next one would be Lela Mosemgvishvili. I'm sorry, I could not pronounce the name properly, probably. So Lela, if you are here with us, please raise your question, ask your question.
Thank you, Gabor. And you pronounced it almost correctly. Thank you, Rebecca, so much for your presence, for your wise words and the review. I want to ask about the concerns about the integrity. Among the number of that you mentioned, I heard the contextualization of contemplative practices, as well as commodification of the solutions, and later on you also addressed it in the different forms of apps and other. I'm curious about how you personally have witnessed and have addressed these concerns in your own teaching. Maybe it is a personal question, but yeah, I'm just curious because I do struggle with this.
It is a struggle, yeah. I mean, I think the stance that we've always taken has been to put our energy and resources into supporting depth and integrity, both in the sort of close-in work that we're doing in our own training program, but also in a wider context, so collaborating with other colleagues and creating join up with in the wider context about what great teaching looks like. And that's very much what the MBI TAC was about. It's very much what the development of the different associations for mindfulness teaching is about. And in a way, with the recognition that there's a lot that we can't control. So there will be pockets of practice that is happening that maybe doesn't have the depth that we would wish for. But actually what we've discovered is that if we put energy into depth and integrity, there's a sort of energy that is created around that, and people want to join, people want to be part of that. So when we initially started it was called the UK Network at that time, but it became the British Association for Mindfulness-Based Approaches. There was just 3 training centres involved in that. I'm not exactly sure how many are there now, but I think it's in the 20s. And, you know, more and more training organisations wanted to be part of this. And in order to be part of this, they had to align themselves with the work that we'd done to clarify good practice. So I think that's really how we've worked with it. It's about communicating and disseminating and sharing and collaborating, and a lot of relational work to build momentum around what good practice looks like and what depth isn't, you know, the depth that's needed. And it's, you know, in a way, it's extraordinary to look back, but actually it's now no longer controversial that it's a good practice norm for mindfulness teachers to go on a retreat every year. And even in our health service, which is, you know, highly financially stretched, it's recognized that that's part of what mindfulness-based teachers need to do as part of their good practice, and that they need supervision in an ongoing way, and that they need to have taken a depth program in order to do this in the first place. Those are not questioned, they're norms now. So I think it's about kind of creating these norms, and not giving too much energy and attention to what's happening that's outside of that, because that will become the less of a problem as we develop more of a body of work that is strong. How does that sound when you hear that?
It's very, I don't know, not comforting, but inspiring, I would say. And it also aligns with how I personally respond.
Yeah.
Generally, instead of focusing on the malpractices or something that angers me or something that I disapprove, to actually put my energy finding like-minded people and doing something constructive. So thank you for inspiring me.
Yeah, thank you, Leila.
Thank you, Leila. Before turning to Gerd and Bruce, I would like to ask Margaret Cullen, if you would like to mention your question, because it was related to Ida's question we have just heard. So, Margaret, would you mind?
Thank you. Thank you, Gabor. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Margaret. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. I had a question about using the TAC in teacher training. I hope you don't mind. I've adapted it for compassion cultivation training.
Yeah.
And thank you. It's been wonderful. And recently, in the past year, we've had the students assess themselves rather than having the teacher assess them. And then we discuss it. And I've been really excited about that switch. And I just wanted to check in with you and see if that's something you're doing or how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved the various creative innovations that have been happening with the MBI TAC as it's gone out into practice, and they come back to us and we think, oh, that sounds really great, and we then start kind of adopting some of these practices. So it's lovely, that you're experimenting with that, and I think it sounds great, actually. And I think the main thing that although I was absolutely central to developing the MBI TAC, I'm probably one of the more cautious people around its use, in the sense that I'm very aware that it can be an interrupter of learning. If we put too much emphasis, particularly early on in teacher training, on this sort of aspiration of what great teaching looks like, rather than putting the emphasis on actually inhabiting where you're at in this moment, that can actually be very unhelpful to training the very capacities that are most important. So I think that's the caveat really that I would have around it so I would tend to perhaps not use the word assessment with your trainees, and invite them to use it more as we were speaking about just now, around feedback and reflection, as a way of offering yourself reflection on where your strengths are and where your growing edges are as a teacher. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I would like to invite Gerd Metz. We have two more critical questions coming, one from Gerd and one from Bruce Bao. So maybe Gerd, if you have the camera and the audio.
Hello, Rebecca. It's beautiful to see you and hear you again. So my question is a little bit a similarity to Leila's question, but I wanted to extend it specifically to companies also. Teaching MBIs with people in companies, so to say, selling MBIs. And so the tension between, I'm very much impressed of, again and again, you focusing on the transformational essence of MBIs and mindfulness. And companies normally are not interested in personal transformation, but they are interested in skills. So they often see mindfulness as a mental training or skill training. And often also the people who they send to the trainings. So how do you experience and how do you go about this tension between the transformational depths and the surface?
Yeah. They're not necessarily contradictory. So, the context that I'm more familiar with is MBCT for depression prevention. So, but the skillful way of engaging with depression prevention and that aspiration is actually not to put a lot of focus on preventing depression, but to put a bigger focus on how are you in relationship with experience, with difficult experience. So in a way, the transformational work happens within the focus, within the focus on actually attending to the instrumental aim that the company might have for the work. But as I think the key thing is that the teacher's kind of willing to, it's absolutely fine if there's a pragmatic benefit of the program for the company. That's absolutely why they would want it. That's the entry point in a way, and that's the reason that they're bringing the mindfulness into their context. But the key thing is that the teacher doesn't see that as the end of the story, and that they're able to hold this wider vision whilst at the same time engaging with those pragmatic realities. So there's something about the teacher being at the fulcrum point between the depth of potential of the practice of mindfulness, but also, the needs of these institutions and people within those institutions, and how they're likely to want to arrive at the course. But completely get it's complex.
Yeah.
And this is part of the reason why teacher training is so involved, because navigating those tensions is challenging. Yeah. I mean, you've do come back at me. I'd love to hear from you too. What would you add to what I've expressed here?
I can very much go with what you say. That's exactly what I try to hold. So the poles of pragmatic outcome on one hand, and maybe for some people, probably not for all in a group, but for some people, they maybe get a taste of, wow, this could be more, this could be deeper.
Yeah. And we're not pushing that, because this is always an invitation.
Yeah.
And people connect with that invitation where they're at in their lives in this moment. And we never know what seeds we're dropping that may flower 20, 30, 40 years from now in that person's being.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerd, for your question. It was really important, I think. I can turn to Bruce Bow now. Bruce, if you are here with us, you raised an interesting point in the chat too, so we may hear it from you.
Thank you, Gabor. Thank you, Professor Crane, for your presentation. I appreciate that your work is concerned with MBIs, and I think MBIs have swept the world, and we may have lost the connection to mindfulness along the way. In part, this was probably due to the way Kabat-Zinn initially introduced MBSR, which, using his umbrella term of mindfulness, basically obscured the contents of the course, which is really a collection of practices and teachings that develop the beneficial life skills that you're promoting, all of which have a potential application in therapy and research. I know before MBCT was introduced, some effort was made to find a theoretical basis for mindfulness within MBSR. And when that failed, then they simply amalgamated some of the principles of the mindfulness program with obviously cognitive behavioral therapy. And as this was being practiced only by psychologists or those with psychological training, they were able to not find any theoretical outcomes, but outcome benefits in secondary relapse in depression, suggested that there were positive benefits, and this is why it's swept the UK National Health Service programme. But it does leave the problem that mindfulness or MBIs in general continue to be criticised for underestimating any links to basic research, to a specification of clear intervention targets and or mediating process of change, which risks situating the study of MBIs, the academic study of MBIs, less as science and more as pseudoscience, in which mindfulness is seen as a panacea for all problems. And basically this comes down to the problem that the assumption that mindfulness meditation is the active ingredient is completely unsupported by evidence. And we have no theoretical definition of mindfulness. We do have Kabat-Zinn's operational definitions, which were designed, as you are promoting, how to teach the practices. But we still have no theoretical definition. We have some people researching into attention, and obviously, as the last comment about business is concerned, their main interest is in the attentional aspect of mindfulness, because they see it as a benefit for the attention economy, where they want to prevent mind wandering. But this, of course, is not mindfulness. And even if we go back to Buddhist origins, we have completely different types of mindfulness, which are conceptually coherent. And
Bruce, could I just pause you a moment and just check in, and just could you sort of see if you could go to the heart of what your question is?
Well, would you agree that the public health impact of MBIs would be enhanced by situating research in a broader framework of clinical psychological science, rather than as it is at the moment in pseudoscience?
Well, I certainly think that the research would benefit from becoming more multidisciplinary. And I think that there's a lot of room for the social sciences to engage, and I think that's already happening. But I don't agree that it's pseudoscience, because there's clearly, people who take MBCT are less likely to get depressed at the end of the following year than those who haven't. There's some clear evidence, from different programs in different contexts of changes that are happening that are actually really meaningful to those individuals in their lives. So this work is having significant traction, and we, but not always, and there's certainly, some trials are showing no benefit, no change, and we need, so there's a lot that we need to learn. It's a new field. We're only 20 years on from the first trial of MBCT, and so it's still incredibly emergent practice. There's a lot that we need to discover, both about how to research, as you're pointed to, really complex, multifaceted constructs and issues, and it's a learning process. So research is always iterative. And there's a lot that needs to be attended to around, what is it exactly that we're researching, and are we missing the main point when we're researching, for example, self-reported mindfulness? There's a lot of debate and exploration around these complex issues. So I think, to say that these themes are are being challenged, and very appropriately so, because that really makes the field step up and keep looking. And I think there's a lot of looking and a lot of inquiry and a lot of exploration around, and a lot of self critique around these, you know, the concerns that there might be around what the evidence is saying and not saying.
I think you missed my point. Everything that you have just said is about outcome research, and all the MBIs have been based on the beginning from therapeutic outcome benefit. My point is that we should be situating the research in a broader framework of clinical psychological science. In other words, relating it to the mind. I mean, after all, psychology is a combination of study of the mind and a social science. And whilst the social science side of psychology has been rampant, my point is that there has been very little effort to look at basic psychological science of the mind, and to look at perhaps the relationship of it to more modern understanding of the mind as an inactive process, rather than the mechanical situation which pertained for psychologists at the time that Kabat-Zinn introduced MBSR back in the early 80s. And psychology and neuroscience at that time attempted to relate it to the brain. So I'm saying that the understanding of the mind has moved on, and it's very important that if we want mindfulness to be recognized, it's all very well to say that it's evidence-based when the only evidence is outcome benefit. Nobody's disputing the outcome benefits which you and your teachers are achieving, but we also need to, if we don't want it to simply be a practice which we don't understand, we need to try and relate it to modern clinical psychological science, which was the, as you asked for, the whole point of my question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of scope to open the research into all sorts of territory. I mean, I think the frontier that I feel energy around is, you know, that I think has been very under-researched is the, because as you say, there's been a lot of emphasis on the impacts on a personal level of people attending these groups, but there's been very little focus on the impacts on a social level of, you know, what happens for people in their social context when they've been on mindfulness courses or within the group spaces. And as we're really looking at how we might mobilize these practices in ways that can actually engage with some of the wider, more systemic social issues that we're facing, I think it is really vital that we discover how we might track that from a research perspective. And I think it's a really big don't know at the moment. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to explore that. So I think you're rightly pointing to the fact that there's a lot we don't know, where it's very emergent, and I feel grateful that you're pushing at the door saying, we need to do more, because it's absolutely true that we do.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Rebecca. And I would just like to turn to the last question, if you allow me. And this is from Hui Ying from Taiwan, who posted a question in Chinese, and Debbie, who helped us to translate it into English. And the question is, in the voyage of the broad vision of mindfulness, how could a mindfulness teacher avoid the pattern of thinking too much, to be distant from him or herself?
Yeah. How can we avoid becoming distant from ourselves?
In the midst of maybe chasing a broad vision and being really practical in teaching. Yeah. So in the midst of all that mechanical, technical processes that we may apply as mindfulness teachers, how can we avoid becoming distant from ourselves and think too much?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's a really beautiful question, and I think it's an ongoing practice and a challenge for all of us. There's a lot of busyness and doing that is needed to bring this work into being, and yet, you know, what we're exploring is the potential for inhabiting a being mode. And a being mode doesn't mean to, you know, that we're not thinking. Of course, you know, as thinking animals, that's part of our capacities. So there's something about celebrating our thinking capacities, but not being consumed or trapped by them. So it, again and again, recognizing that we have these different ways of relating to experience. We can sense our experience, and thoughts are part of that process, but we can also think about, and both are important, but it's important to ensure that we don't get that we're not always in the thinking about mode, because that's where we get distanced from the immediacy of experience. So it's like, how can we keep this returning, this reconnecting, the regrounding? And I don't think there's any magic to that other than doing it and really ensuring that we have a daily body practice on a formal level that really embeds that as a way of being, and that we're practicing coming back within the day, moment by moment. But I appreciate the question, because it really goes to the heart of the challenge that we're engaged in when we're navigating the mainstream, which is so full of constructs and ideas and theories, and we have to engage with all of that. You know, it's part of the territory. But it's like engaging with all of it and not being consumed by it, being sort of recognizing that this is, you know, at one level, all of that is a construct, and there's also this potential to inhabit the immediacy of experience.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Actually, I wanted to express our deep gratitude from the Mind and Life Europe community for attending our Emily friends and community tonight and giving us this talk. I kept a few highlights of your talk. One was the focus on an embodied lived experience. I think that was number 4 of the 6 points you mentioned, that we need to embody mindfulness, and that was the answer to Wei Ying's question as well.
Absolutely.
And also the focus on relational skills, so that we are not only minds, but we are also embodied, and we are also living in cultural, social, relational contexts, and we can't simply cut ourselves off from our but embodied and relational contexts. And that's a very important point to remember, so that we can keep the main point in mind, which is, as you mentioned, the main thing is to keep the main thing.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful statement. Thank you so much for highlighting that and sharing your deep learning and wisdom, and not only that, but also your embodied presence tonight with us, and your wonderful experiences, personal experiences with this journey. And that's what drew us here tonight, all of us from all over the world. Thank you all who participated and followed this. I would just like to mention that all the Spanish, French, and Chinese versions of tonight's talk and discussion will be shared on our YouTube channel. And I would just like to post our YouTube channel here so that you can save it and come back at any later point in time. You can also find the English version, the original English version there. And finally, I would like to invite you all to take a look and join our special Mind and Life Europe Friends, Emily Friends program. We organize specific talks and internal in-depth discussions on these topics on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. So if you are interested in learning more, exploring more, please feel free to join the Special Emily Friends program and come back next year to these monthly discussions and talks. And thank you so much, Rebecca, once again, Professor Crane, to share everything and join us today.
Thank you, Gabor, and thank you for the leadership work you're doing within Mind and Life Europe. It's just such beautiful work and so important.
Thank you very much. And thank you all. I hope we can see each other again next year. This was the last event of our extensive and productive year at Mind and Life Europe.